Hello again. I'm Dan Bowles, and this is the 6th video lecture in a series to teach the principles of physical existence as presented in my book, Are We Just Bubbles? An Alternate View of Existence. In the last lecture, we developed a 3D proportional expansion model for the cubical vacuum space bubbles. This was done because any external actions affecting the space bubble expansion acts equally in any direction, and we wanted to show the expansion distortion independent of space bubble axis orientation. This is the space bubble representation, cubical. This is the expansion model, which is a sphere. In the last lecture, we developed a 3D proportional expansion model for the cubical vacuum space bubbles. This was done because any external actions affecting the space bubble expansion acts equally in any direction, and we wanted to show the expansion distortion independent of the space bubble axis orientation. Here is a representation of a cubical vacuum space bubble. It's stationary in space. It cannot rotate or move through the other bubbles. But when it's restricted in its expansion, it's restricted proportionally. So in order to represent that, we have a spherical representation of the cubical vacuum space bubble that's going to show the expansion distortion. This will allow us to orient this in any direction with this axis aligned with the object that it's going to be acting on, whereas we couldn't do that with this. So to review, we have this cubical representation of a vacuum space bubble, just one of an inconceivably large number of vacuum space bubbles in the universe. Each bubble is centered on its X, Y, Z axis, and the bubble is expanding about this axis from a source of new space material that is inside of it. This expansion is invisible to us, as is the vacuum space bubble itself. Since a space bubble is stationary and cannot share space with others, when it expands, it is expanding into a space that never was existing before as our universe. All these bubbles are expanding, and they're expanding into a space that never was before in the universe. I call this space that is not part of our universe the void. And the expansion rate of the vacuum space bubbles is what we think of as the speed of light. We know this because the gravity force and the electric and magnetic forces travel through vacuum space by virtue of ripples in the expansion of the vacuum space bubbles past one to the other in sequence. And this equates to the wave passing at the expansion rate. The reason why we can't see the expansion is because all of our measurement standards, the meters, miles, kilometers, etc., are based on distances of space in our universe, and all of it is expanding. Our rulers stretch with space, and we can't see any physical change with this absolute universe expansion. This was discussed in the very first lecture, and is really the basis for this whole theory of an expanding bubble universe. Absolute universe expansion, which is what I call this, that we can't see, is not to be confused with the expansion that we can observe in our universe. Observable universe expansion is actual movement of bodies through vacuum space, or more compacted regions of space incrementally expanding relative to our immediate vacuum space. We cannot see this absolute expansion, but we can use our imaginations to step outside of the universe and see it expand into the void relative to its initial size when it was first formed. The French is a unit of measurement to use in the void when describing the amount of expansion the universe has undergone. It is the initial diameter of the universe, if we assume that the universe was a sphere when it began. So, when I say that the vacuum space bubbles are expanding at the speed of light, what I mean is that each bubble is expanding into the void in French units at a rate that defines the speed of light as we see it. I want to mention here that a rate normally implies that something is happening with the independent passage of time. But in this case, the expansion from within each bubble is the only independent thing in the entire universe. Without it, nothing happens. Time passes because of the linear expansion of space, not the other way around. Now let's get back to the proportional expansion model for the cubical vacuum space bubbles. Since a sphere linear expansion is the same in all directions with proportional expansion, we used a sphere centered on an XYZ axis to represent perfect proportional expansion of the cubical vacuum space bubble. The axis of the sphere is arbitrary relative to the vacuum space bubble axis, and it may be aligned relative to forces or objects affecting the vacuum space bubble. So in previous lectures, we have talked about compacted groups of space bubbles with a density greater than the vacuum space bubbles. That density relates to the mass. We discussed how the groups expand proportionally with vacuum space bubbles, and how each bubble within the group must be expanding slower than the vacuum space bubbles based on the density of the group. This keeps the proportionality the same. These slower expanding bubbles then affect the vacuum space bubbles around the object because the sides of the slower expanding bubbles must remain congruent with the vacuum space bubble sides, resulting in a slower expansion for them. This slower expansion of the vacuum space bubbles around the objects causes a reduction in the vacuum space pressure all around it in a radial direction. The distortion of the vacuum space bubble expansion is in the z direction of the proportional expansion model for the vacuum space bubble, which is oriented in a radial direction with respect to the object and perpendicular to the surface tangent. So the cubical vacuum space bubbles around a massive object, when we're talking about the effects of gravity, this z-axis would be aligned perpendicular to a tangent on the surface of the object. And the restriction and expansion that the object presents to the vacuum space bubble causes it to flatten in the z direction, which causes a reduced pressure all around the object, massive object that is being considered. So this results in a reduction in the space pressure that we talked about earlier around the object. That was for the gravity. And now we're going to explore what electric charges are and how they distort the vacuum space bubbles. Here are some things that we already know about electric charges and some things that we discovered in previous lectures. First, there are two types of charges, positive and negative. Secondly, we know that the charges come in discrete quantities and are confined to matter. Objects that also have a property of mass, and so the charges must therefore be a particular arrangement of compacted space bubbles. Third, we know that unlike charged bodies, positively and negatively charged bodies exhibit an attractive force between them, and that like charged bodies, positively or negatively and negatively charged bodies exhibit a repulsive force between them. We know that the electrical forces between charged objects can be transferred through vacuum space bubbles, and that the forces are transferred at the speed of light. Fifth, we know that a charged object with mass, such as a proton or an electron, can move through the stationary vacuum space medium or remain stationary relative to it and simultaneously exhibit properties of mass and properties of charged objects. Sixth, from previous lectures, we know that the only forces that can be transferred through the vacuum space bubbles to objects of mass is caused by an imbalance in vacuum space bubble expansion, which results in a vacuum space pressure differential in the stationary vacuum space medium. The vacuum space bubbles are distorted in the z direction when they are around the massive objects, and that would be relative to the spherical expansion model in the z direction, which is the vertical axis. But the electrical distortion shape must be different from the gravitational distortion shape. This is because electrical distortion does not directly affect gravitational distortion. Also, the vacuum space bubbles must have a distortion shape that are complementary if the objects are to have an attractive force imparted to the positively and negatively charged objects. And the vacuum space bubbles must have distortion shapes that are alike and conflict with each other for like charged objects to have repulsive forces imparted between them. If gravitational distortion is in the z direction of the vacuum space bubble expansion model, in the z direction, which would be vertical, and then the electric and magnetic vacuum space bubble distortions would have to be in the model's planar x and y axis. The x and y axis. Like the gravity distortion, the electrical distortions are probably not completely uniform around the objects and depend upon the vacuum space bubble's position relative to different groups of space bubbles comprising the charged objects. But when added up, the resulting distortion would be predominantly in the x or y plane that is parallel to the charged object's surface. Now, I haven't mentioned it until now, but vacuum space bubbles can also have positive expansion distortion instead of gravity's negative restriction distortion. That is, the rate of expansion in certain directions of the x and y portions of the vacuum space bubble proportional distortion model can be incrementally increased to cause a bulge in the vacuum space bubble distortion sphere in an x or y direction. The two different and complementary expansions are caused by the two different positive and negatively charged objects. This is what happens to the vacuum space bubbles around a charged body. In both the positive and negative case, there is an incremental increase in the volume of universe space within the vacuum space bubbles as a result of the distortion. And this is equivalent to the energy that we can normally see. In a static situation, these distortions are passed from one vacuum space bubble to the other to form electric field lines around the object, diminishing as the radial distance increases. The electrical distortion in the vacuum space bubbles around the charged object from the electrical flux lines, and even though this flux is invisible, it is not magic. The field is still real, contains energy, and consists of distortions in the only physical component of the universe. Now I have a little illustration here of a proportional model of a vacuum space bubble that has a bulging distortion in the x-axis. This is the z, and this other axis here would be the y-axis. So this has a bulging distortion, which the additional energy, the additional volume that this contains represents visible energy that we can see because it is an incremental change in the normal expansion of the spherical vacuum space bubble model. Now, if there's two of these, there can be in the x direction, or if we looked at this from the top, we could see that it could be the x or the y. You can make it x or y. They're the two different ones, positive and negative expansion distortion. Now in my book, I've represented these things as, here's the spherical model, perfect sphere. There's no irregularities in the expansion, proportionality. Then this bubble is expanding at what we think of as speed of light. Here is the restriction expansion in the z direction. This is y, or x, and y would be looking right into the paper. You can't see that, but y would be looking right into the paper. And so it actually restricts the normal expansion in the gravity model, which reduces the space pressure around the object. Negative distortion, which I've arbitrarily represented as in the y direction of the proportional expansion model, you can see that the volume is increased, and the y direction of this it's an ellipsoid. And that extra volume represents an amount of energy that we could see in our universe. So energy is held in these flux, electric flux. And here would be in the x direction, and we'd be looking down on this. The z would be down this way, and so we can see that we have extra volume there as well. Since the electrical distortion is expansive, it also increases the space pressure in the x or y direction of the proportional expansion model for the vacuum space bubbles. A charged object is surrounded by vacuum space bubbles having a higher space pressure in the x or y dimension depending upon its positive or negative polarity. Like the gravitational z direction reduction in space pressure of the vacuum space bubble surrounding an object, the x or y increase in vacuum space bubble pressure surrounds the charged object with a net zero force on the object. Since the two electrical distortions are orthogonal to each other, and also to the gravitational z direction, the pressures only act on objects having differentials in vacuum space bubble pressure in the same direction, that is, in the x or y directions. So now if two positively charged objects are brought into the vicinity of each other with increased space pressure in the x direction, the addition of the two vacuum space bubble pressures in the x direction on the side of the objects facing each other will apply an unbalancing force that will be in a direction to separate the two objects. Likewise, when two negatively charged objects having increased vacuum space bubble pressure in the y direction are brought in the vicinity of each other, they also experience a force to separate them. And if two oppositely charged objects are brought in the vicinity of each other, they will have forces applied from the vacuum space bubbles on the sides away from the two objects, which will push them together. This is due to the unbalanced lower pressures of the vacuum space bubbles in the respective x and y directions on the object's sides facing each other. This pretty much covers the electrical distortion and the forces acting upon charged bodies through vacuum space. In the case of magnetic distortion, the vacuum space bubble distortions are produced by objects composed of atoms and molecules which have a much higher density of configured space particles. And these molecules have both complements of the magnetic distortion so that they form dipoles. One side a north pole, the other side a south pole. This magnetic distortion from the molecule is mainly caused by the relatively unbalanced movement of charged electrons within it. And this in turn is caused by the arrangement and expansion of the clusters and subclusters of space bubbles within the nucleus of the atom. Remember, all particles in the nucleus, electrons, everything is made of compacted space bubbles, anything that has mass. And so these charged particles, whether it be an electron or a proton, are a particular arrangement of space bubbles that cause the distortions to be positive or negative. So the magnetic force is really produced by a moving charged body through the stationary vacuum space medium. It doesn't require that it be contained in an atom or a molecule. An electron or a proton can be shot through vacuum space independently as in a vacuum tube, and a resulting magnetic field will exist encircling it in a plane orthogonal to the direction of travel. This is how they accelerate protons in the Large Hadron Collider in CERN. They have this solenoid, which is a big electromagnet that has a moving magnetic field that pushes on the proton to get it moving in vacuum space inside of the tube. The requirement of moving the charged object through the vacuum space bubble medium for the magnetic effect to exist suggests that the distortion of the vacuum space bubbles as a charged object moves through causes a vacuum space bubble XY expansion wake, much like a wave in an ocean. The wave, actually the wave is the movement of water up and down, and it propagates at a speed that is perpendicular to that. This wake would be in a direction orthogonal to that caused by the charged object. And similar to inertia for massive objects, no net force will be applied to the moving charged object as long as the vacuum space bubbles are allowed to expand and contract freely that it's going through. If, however, another charged object is in the path of the electric flux, and the vacuum space bubbles interacting with it causes a restriction in the free expansion or contraction of the vacuum space bubble as the charged object moves through, then a force will be applied to both objects. Also, separately, the requirement of change in velocity of the charged particle to create the magnetic inertial force of inductance, and that the rate of change, the acceleration of it, is proportional to the inductive inertial force. This suggests that this force is something akin to the inertial force experienced for massive objects. In other words, the electrical force is proportional to the amount of charge on the two bodies and the rate of acceleration of the charged body. This relationship is expressed as Faraday's law in classical physics, where the voltage induced in a conductor by a changing magnetic flux is opposite the flux inducing voltage and proportional to the rate of change. Now that's a mouthful, but that's what Faraday's law is. The magnetic field lines or flux around a magnet are no more than a wake in the vacuum space bubbles caused by moving charges in the magnet. As long as the stream of moving charges persist in movement at a constant rate, the flux lines will remain constant. The force on a charged object moving across the constant field lines of a magnetic field, which are again no more than strings of distorted vacuum space bubbles, that force is proportional to the velocity of the charged particle and in a direction that is at right angles to both the magnetic flux lines and the velocity path of the charged body. Now, if you're in the basic elementary physics and you're studying magnetic fields, you might have seen the right-hand rule, which if this is the direction of the magnetic field and this index finger is the direction of movement, then the force applied to electron will be in this direction, up. So they're all at right angles to each other. That's called the right-hand rule. But this same magnetic force that is applied by the electron moving through a field could be applied to a stationary charged body by replacing the magnetic field with a static electric field whose strength was proportional to the velocity of the moving charged object and whose electric field orientation was orthogonal to the magnetic field in the XY plane and orthogonal to the charged object's path. In other words, the same force could be applied by a charged stationary charge. If it was stationary, not moving, you could replace the magnetic field with another charged object in the right positions and get the same force on the object. Now we know from classical physics that the direction of the magnetic field encircling a moving charged body with respect to its direction of movement depends upon the polarity of the charged body, whether it's positive or negative, whether it's an electron or proton. We know that moving a charged body in a direction orthogonal to a magnetic field will cause a force to be applied to it. We know that moving a wire containing free electrons in a direction orthogonal to the magnetic flux lines will apply a force to the electrons and cause them to move in the wire. If the electrons are then allowed to flow in a circuit, a force resulting from the restriction of free expansion of the vacuum space bubbles will act on the magnet and the wire with force requiring work to make the current flow. This is how an electrical generator works. All of these actions are no more than just forces of electrical attraction and repulsion on the objects caused by distortion of the vacuum space bubbles in the X or Y direction. So in reality, there is just the vacuum space bubble electrical X and Y distortions acting on the charged objects, and no separate magnetic force as such. So in summary, in the last two lectures, 5 and this one, number 6, I have coarsely shown how the gravitational and electromagnetic forces applied to objects of matter with mass are the result of expansion distortion in the vacuum space bubbles surrounding them. This distortion causes a vacuum space pressure imbalance, resulting in a force applied to the objects. Electrostatic, magnetic, and gravitational fields and flux consist of strings of distorted vacuum space bubbles, which are passed one to the other around the object in a diminishing fashion. The vacuum space bubble distortions are passed one to the other by virtue of the restricting boundary conditions between them, and they would be the sole cause of the invisible, mysterious forces acting on objects of matter at a distance. This news would cause Albert Einstein and Isaac Newton to be dancing right now, because they believe there was some physical cause of all of the gravitational and electrical forces. And what I've just shown is that there is an ether, though not what we think of as a conventional ether. It is invisible expanding space bubbles that everything consists of, including space. And it is through these things that cause all of these mysterious actions that we see: inertia, gravity, electrical forces, and that sort of thing. Thank you for listening.